Okay, so this is our second session in our series on Africana philosophy. These are discussion groups hosted by Oxford Public Philosophy, which is a group trying to, make philosophy more accessible and enjoyable for everyone. We have Samuel Imbo with us today, who's going to be talking about oral traditions within Africana philosophy. He is professor of philosophy and department chair at Hamline University, and his teaching, writing, and research interests are in the area of comparative philosophy, African philosophy, and social and political philosophy. Sam combined his training in philosophy with an interest in study abroad and has led study abroad trips to Kenya and Jamaica. He also taught a block seminar in Germany at Trier University in 2008 on the theme of American Islam. So, yeah, I think over to Sam, and we'll just start on our discussion group.
Well, thank you very much. It is always fun to be part of a group like this. I really appreciate the invitation. My only connection to the UK is fairly minimal. I think in 2013 and 2014, I lived in New York at the University of York, and so I have spent a total of one afternoon at Oxford. I really did like the experience. I could live there a lot longer, but I'm really glad to be part of this. And I look at the list of other speakers. It is people whose work I respect a lot, and they have informed my own work in African philosophy. Now, my connection with this program, I think I first received a message in February of this year. 2020 has been going on for a long time. It seems like many years ago. But in February, I got reaching out saying, we were thinking about doing this Oxford public philosophy thing. And some of the questions we were interested in are questions such as, how ought we to be doing philosophy? And what role could public philosophy have, especially as it relates to philosophy as a discipline? And what should the roles of universities be in promoting public philosophy? And those questions moved me because I have been thinking about philosophy in fairly non-traditional ways. I went to a fairly regular philosophy program in the United States, and what I found there was good, but it was lacking in some respects. So I thought, what you are interested in doing is very good to proceed with. And so this is why I keep saying I'm glad to be part of this project. Now, some of my work has been in other things, but I have spent a little bit of time thinking about oral philosophy. In 2018, I did a podcast with Professor Peter Adamson on discussing the topic of one of my books. Okot Pabitek was a theorist from Uganda who was interested in cultural forms and what they said about the philosophy of a people. So my book about what could Okot tell African philosophy about what philosophy is what we were talking about then. So hopefully you have had a chance to listen to that podcast. If not, the internet never forgets. So you can look it up and you'll find it at some point. So that is one of the things that might give you a sense of what all I talk about. A little bit earlier, in 2001, I had written that book in which I was laying out what is Okot Pabitek and what is his contribution to what we all are doing. Fascinating for me was the idea that what people do on a day-to-day basis is a manifestation of their philosophy of life. So for Okot Pabitek, that is what he thought was happening. And that was fascinating to me. So I pursued that project as a way of rounding out some of the other things I was doing in the field. Now, this might be of interest to you. Okot Pabitek studied in the UK as well, and he actually went to Oxford for social anthropology. So he got his degrees at Oxford. He was writing about Acholi and language cultural forms, and for him, he was not very satisfied with what his very eminent teachers had to say about those topics. He thought there was a lot that was missing. And that is the sense in which he then carried on his work to kind of fill in the gaps of what the education was not giving to him. So let me talk briefly about where this leads me, why I am interested in these issues. I have been thinking about these topics for a while now, and teaching in a philosophy department, I came to the realization that there's a lot that we are not doing. So I have a mix of prepared statements and things I just want to say off the cuff. We don't have as much time. And so what I'm going to be doing when you see me looking down, I am reading just a paragraph or so from some comments that I think would be helpful to frame what I am doing. So philosophy as it is practiced in the United States is one of the least diverse disciplines, both in terms of demographic composition and in terms of openness to other ways of thinking about subject area. So we're not very diverse in the United States. It might be a little different in the UK, but you all can tell me what your experience with the field is. The problem is compounded in our situation by the conflation of Africana philosophy with the unexamined belief that it is the work of Black philosophers. So those of us who are interested in philosophy, we face the additional task of when people think about Africana philosophy, they think it is something Black people do. It is not what everybody should be doing. So that is one set of the problems. So what that has meant in practical life is that any department of philosophy that does not have a Black philosopher is unlikely to have Africana philosophy as part of its offerings. There are going to be few exceptions, but Africana philosophy tends to follow people who are African or Black or diasporic Africans in many settings. Now, think about the impact of that on the field, on the people who are interested in philosophy. If you are studying philosophy and you never see this offered as a possibility, you might think that philosophy does not really care about things that are dear to you. So one of the things that has happened is many students then move on to other disciplines which seem more relevant, which seem much more attuned to what they're interested in. So there are costs to how we do these things. Now, as a discipline, the philosophy has a lesson to teach the humanities. And I thought, I want to see what we can do to actually make things better. So this is why I talk about Africana philosophy. Now, Africana philosophy, as you probably heard last week, one of the people I respect is Professor Chike Jaffas. In his talking about what Africana philosophy is, he must have mentioned to you that it is a broad field that covers many things. What we are all trying to do is to rewrite the intellectual practice to include Africana philosophy in the history of philosophy and disciplines much more generally. So how can we think about the fields we are engaged in a broader sense? So African, in the case of the United States, African Americans, Caribbean thinkers have all been undertaking projects which are relevant to their own fields of study as a way of expanding, whether they're teaching literature or biology or physics or philosophy or history, they want to see those ideas into the fields that they're engaged with. So that is the broader context for why Africana philosophy is interesting to you. Africana philosophy is itself a broad term, as I've been saying. It covers the experiences, it tries to articulate the experiences of Black people, widely construed, and Africans, African Americans, Caribbeans, people of the diaspora, everyone whose experience has not been central to the academic practices. We want to have a voice in what is happening. So Africana philosophy is an effort to mount a critique on the existing fields of endeavor in the university by putting Africana intellectual practice and inquiry at the center of what we are doing. Now, Africana thought is fairly broad. It covers many fields. There are people in media studies. There are people in the visual arts. It might include theater. It might include history. It might include literature, music. Any idea of Black experience and what it can contribute to the rest of knowledge is what Africana thinkers are trying to do. So Africana philosophy is going to have different orientations. It is not going to be, as of now, a fairly uniform way of approaching these subject areas. There is not a standard yet. We are building as we go along. So part of the project here is to think about how might we include or expand the fields we are already engaged in. I happen to be a philosopher, and so my interest is in expanding the field of philosophy. Those of you who are into literature or history, it might look a little different. So this is kind of a long way of saying, why am I interested in these things? I could talk briefly about the book from 2001 because it lays out some of the themes that Africana philosophy for me are going to be concerned with. In that book, I very specifically chose to talk about philosophy by using somebody who is not typically known as a philosopher. Okot Pabitek was many things, but he did not claim to be a philosopher. He actually looked down on that term. He thought of himself as a boxer, as a dancer, as a cultural theorist, and those were things that moved him. Philosophy, not so much. And so in choosing Okot Pabitek, I was making the case that maybe some of the people or some of the topics we have not typically thought of as being philosophical may have a lot of impact on the field itself. Okot, in his way of writing, marking down the traditions of his own people, was actually interested in very philosophical ideas. So in reading his work, some of the themes that occur to me, I see in his work a focus on things such as, what does beauty mean? So standards of beauty come up for discussion. What is the nature of time? Time is becoming slightly different now than it was in the before times. And Africans have always thought about, what does time mean? And there are treatises about African conceptions of time. So Okot is concerned with those types of issues as well. In Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania and East Africa and the rest of Africa, excluding the Muslim parts, he was interested with what Christianity means in an African context. So Ugandans had been converted in large numbers to the Christian religion, and Okot was interested in what that meant for identity. So what does Christianity look like in a place that is different from where it started? What does culture really mean? So he was interested in issues of culture. The issue of African identity looms large in what he was doing. And so part of his focus was on, when are you authentic? What does real mean? And for him, there was an ongoing discussion about those things in the African context. I focused mostly on those cultural and philosophical types of things, but Okot was also interested in African politics after the colonial experience. And so in a number of his writings, he is engaged with what Africa has become since independence. So those who are independent from Britain, those who are independent from France, those who are independent from Germany, how do they look like now? What is the new situation like? So some of the songs have to do with neo-colonialism and what has not changed, even though the times and political situations are very different. So for me, this non-philosopher was really interested in issues of social philosophy, issues of practical philosophy, political philosophy, even though he did not call explicitly those names out. He was not saying that I am now doing philosophy on this, that, and the other. So that is why I chose Okot Pabitek. For him, the real question is, what does philosophy look like, even if you don't use the name, but you do it in the parameters of African oral literature? What does a philosophical idea look like in very different packaging? And those who are not looking there are going to miss it. And he thought a lot of Africans and a lot of non-Africans did not see what was right in front of them. So this was fascinating to me as a way of thinking about, could philosophy be there when people do not see that it is there, and what do we do about it? Now, in the book, I talk about the issues that are interesting in terms of oral traditions. Okot Pabitek was interested in the dances, in the proverbs, in the day-to-day life activities of an African people. And for him, this was the idea that they carried out the deep thoughts in these daily activities. So one of the things I was interested in my book is, so how does one define philosophy? How does one define African philosophy? I have been interested in that question for many years now. The issue of defining African philosophy was the subject of my first book, An Introduction to African Philosophy, in which I laid out the discussions up to that point in the late 1990s, what we were talking about then. It seems like so long ago, but what we were thinking about then and what we are still talking about today is philosophy dependent on writing? So the issue of orality becomes a central one to think about, because the moment you begin defining African philosophy, the issue of writing comes up, and the issue of does philosophy depend on writing becomes a central question. Okot was making the point that it does not, and it should not. And so this is what makes his work controversial, if you think about it. I followed that discussion with what happens if we assume that philosophy means a certain thing. If we assume that writing is central to philosophy, what are the consequences of that? And this becomes a really central issue again, because the consequences are, they go beyond academics. They go to issues of identity. They go to issues of power division among people, among regions of the world. Philosophy is not simply about disinterested, objective ideas. It's something out there in the world. And so how you define it has an impact on how you move around in the world. And I thought that was an astute observation on the part of Okot Pabitek. So the question for us is, the implications are going to be, if you define philosophy one way, you're going to define it as including or excluding some things. And that inclusion or exclusion carries a lot of cost. You're going to have to make a statement about what religion means. And this is why Okot was interested in the religions of Africa and the religions of formerly conquered peoples. What does religion mean? What does Christianity mean in this new context? You're going to have to rethink the idea of what literature means. Okot Pabitek thought to himself that he was engaged with African literature. The literature was not written down. It was in songs passed down from one generation to another. And there were experts who were very good at remembering and transmitting the songs. That was the way literature worked. And for him, this was unique. Now comes the colonial powers who say that this is not literature at all. Oral literature does not deserve the name literature. And so one of the implications of definition is ruling out that which you take to be important. And Okot Pabitek was going to fight that in particular. So the implications of definitions turn out to be important. If you privilege writing, one of the things you're going to do is also redraw where the power boundaries are. So there are cultures in which writing was not a main part of what they did. There are cultures for which writing is a big part. And so if philosophy and literature and history and everything else depends on texts that have been written, this rules out large parts of the world. And for Okot and those of us who grew up in colonial countries, that was not going to be sustainable. And so part of the fighting back is simply some definitions are really harmful from that point of view. And of course, it raises the question very prominently of what a text is. What is a text? Writing defines texts as pieces of paper on which things have been written down, or writing in some form as constituting what is really important. What if you don't have writing? And many cultures in Africa relied on other modes of knowledge transmission, not on writing. do they not have texts? So that becomes an issue to discuss. One of the chapters I was interested in was the issue of oral traditions and power relations within African cultures. And so the issue of where do women fit in African traditional cultures was fascinating to me, because I was also interested in feminism. And could one be a feminist and a believer in African traditional values? And the thing I came to in the early 2000s was that African traditional values bear many meanings. Each of them has multiple layers of meanings, and there are different ways to interpret any tradition that you pick up on. So, of course, yes, it is possible to be a feminist within that tradition. It's just going to look very, very different from what feminism might look in other places. So one of the issues that I engaged in back then was, how does one practice being an ally or being an accomplice or being a feminist in an African context? And I think, again, it has been many years. I don't remember the specifics of what I wrote back then. But I think the point I was making is, if you are going to be a helper in African settings, you must begin from a position of understanding African traditions. So African traditions are going to be central to any work one does. What I was trying to forestall was the idea of outsiders coming in with ready-made solutions to what the problems in African context might be. Because that had been happening a lot, it still happens. And I think feminism is not helped by that kind of approach. And I think this is quite consonant with what Pabitek was saying about religion. If somebody brings to you a package and they call this Islam or they call this Christianity, and the package is given to you as fully made and you have no contribution to make to it, you should run. Don't believe them. You already have things that are going to count for religion. If anything comes in, it should take into account what you already have and then mold itself in ways that are compatible with what you're doing. So his criticism of Western religions was that they wanted to take over completely and ignore what was happening already. And so I think one could say the same thing about any attempt to understand African traditions must begin with, surprise, surprise, understanding African traditions. So that is one of the issues of consideration. We can talk about that if people have questions about it much later. I have examples of who some of the feminists doing interesting work are, and we can talk about that. Okot Pabitek was interested in religion particularly because many people who had converted to Christianity then had a different view of their own identity. They saw themselves as primarily Christian and not African because Christianity took over or subsumed all parts of their identity. And so Okot was interested in, how do African religions look in Western scholarship? And his point was, they don't fare too well because the comparisons are not even. And so one of the chapters I am interested in is his examination of what Christianity looked like when it was transmitted to Uganda and to other parts of Africa. You had to kind of fit this very alien thing into a culture in which it was not previously known, and he doesn't think that happened very well. So his point was, African religions tend to be ignored or feature very badly in Western scholarship. Now, one of the other issues that I was interested in is, if you're thinking about religion or moving between contexts, what happens when we translate ideas from one place to another? So the problem of translation was interesting for me. And if you're interested in oral traditions, the problem of translation becomes even more complex because we're not working from any written documents. And so how does one translate a concept between languages, between cultures? How does an idea move from one place to another? And I think Okot was sometimes unfair to things he was comparing. So he would make fun of the Christians for saying what seemed to him like ridiculous things. But if you take the point he's making seriously, that some ideas do not work in a different context, I think that would be something worth building on. So the place he goes to fairly often is in the Gospel of John. According to John, the part that begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That is a fairly difficult thing to translate into African languages. What do you mean in the beginning was the Word? Is the Word separate from, or similar to, or one with this thing that you're calling God? And so Okot had all kinds of problems with translations which did not work. And I think the wider problem he was making here was that when we translate, again, it is important that we be aware of the culture that we are translating into, as well as the culture that we're translating from, so that failure to take seriously any one of these components is going to result in ridiculous translations or ideas that do not work. Now, just think about how big a problem this was. There are many African languages. The Bible had to be translated into many African languages. So this problem appeared over and over again. How do you translate the words of the good book into languages which may not have those concepts? And so the issue of translation is one that orality struggles with a lot. How does one translate fairly? Now, Bitek's point, and a point I want to highlight, is that there is always a danger of distorting that which you're looking at. So whether it is religion, whether it is literature, whether it is philosophy, that which is being looked at is going to be distorted in ways that make it seem ridiculous. And so that is an ongoing problem as well. So in that book, what I was doing was simply using Okot Bitek as an avenue for looking at if philosophy was to think of itself very, very differently, how would it play out in these various parts? So identity and language and feminism and other things begin to look very, very different. And that, I think, is an ongoing project. So we need to be talking about those things even today. So if I was to summarize the big themes that orality says to me, orality brings to me the idea of philosophy as being really important in two precise areas. Area number one is that oral traditions are a way of transmitting something really valuable, what Okot called the philosophy of life of a people. So oral values are being transmitted in that way. We ought to be able to get at what is behind the practices. So looking at the practice is simply one way to get at what is happening. Now, the narratives and everyday life are performative practices which carry within them something much deeper. And if you miss everything else from what we're talking about, philosophy is about getting at that deeper aspect of what people are doing. It's not looking at the appearances and the surface. It's really looking to see what is behind the practice. And so when I offered Pabitek and oral traditions as philosophy, I was not making the case that oral traditions in themselves are the philosophy. I was criticized a lot for doing that. I have since gotten tired of clarifying this point. If people do not get it, I don't know what else to do. No, the oral traditions are not on their surface what the philosophy is. They give you an entry into looking for what the philosophy is. If you're not willing to look there, you're not going to see. So the task of the philosopher is to look behind the practices and to see what lies back there. And the reason for this is obvious. Practices of any kind, just like symbols that we use to carry meaning, are always ambiguous. They mean multiple things at any one time. So if somebody showed me the flag of the United States and said, here is what it means, yeah, in some sense, they are right about it means that, but it means other things as well. So flags, an image of a dove might mean one thing in one context, it might mean something else in another. And so cultures are always exposing us to different ways that people make meaning, and there's always argument and disagreement about them. Now, one of the other criticisms, if you say cultures are ways of transmitting philosophies of life and there are multiple meanings, I got criticized for saying that because it doesn't seem like people in African contexts are arguing with each other a lot. So oral traditions are going to bring about much more uniformity or unanimity or lack of argument, and that is always bad for progress. So this is the criticism, that oral traditions do not lend themselves to arguing back and forth about what they mean. I want to make the case that no traditions mean just one thing. And so even somebody we might like a lot might be interpreted in other ways. So as a way of making that point, I really admired Okot Pabitek and the work that he did over many years. But one of my criticisms of Okot Pabitek is that he exhibited a kind of cultural nationalism that is itself fairly dangerous. The idea that African culture means this, and anybody who thinks differently about it is either simply wrong or does not quite get the full gist of it. So even somebody we agree with could be read in multiple ways. And one of my tributes to Okot Pabitek was he gives us a way in, and then we can argue amongst ourselves about what is the right thing to do. I could talk briefly about Okot Pabitek. After his studies in the UK, he went back to Uganda, and he became director of the National Cultural Theatre. And so one of the arguments he had fairly early on is, what does cultural performance mean in the Ugandan context? If we have a national theater, what kinds of things should we be putting out? And his sense was, we want traditional dances, we want traditional forms of engagement. And the people who were running the theater at that time had very different ideas about what performance meant. And so Okot Pabitek is moving people to think about performance in very different ways, even if you disagree with his vision of what that performance is. So one can agree to an extent with people who are giving us new visions, but then philosophy is simply the art of pointing out the ways in which people are similar or different. So that happened. The other people who are engaged in a similar project, I grew up in Kenya in the 1960s and 70s. It was a lucky time because at the University of Nairobi was a professor by the name of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I went to the university, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o was in disagreement with the local academic community about what should a department of literature in Africa look like. And he began teaching courses in oral literature. And he was told, no, you cannot do that. Oral literature is not literature. Only Shakespeare is. And so he disagreed with his former teachers and began teaching other things that were not deemed literature. So the disagreements here are moving us forward about what do we think literature and philosophy is. I got my start in African philosophy by going to the philosophy department at the University of Nairobi. At that point, we had people who were pioneering in that field. So Professor Odera Oruka, one of the premier African philosophers, and Dismas Masolo, and they brought into our view people who were arguing back and forth about what should African philosophy look like. So Kwasi Wiredu made an appearance sometime, and there were other people who showed up to talk about ways in which we could advance the field. So by happenstance, I happened to be going to university when these things were happening, redefining the field. And that was an opportunity I wished everybody else has. So one of the things that oral traditions give us are how can we get to the real life-giving stuff that people are doing? And a disagreement amongst ourselves is not going to be seen as a negative. So philosophy is at the very heart of it, I think, and this is my concluding point. It is always about identity. When African philosophers are arguing about writing and text and orality, what they're really arguing about is, what does our identity really comprise of? And the issue of identity shows up in multiple areas. I was saying to you that if you define philosophy as writing, you're going to rule out people who do philosophy in other ways. So those who are not writing are not going to be seen as philosophers. And think about those who are engaged in music or literature or religion or any other area of culture. Their identity is going to be seen as less than. So philosophy is at the very heart of it, a fight for a new identity. And Africana identity is getting more and more complex as time goes by. So my own engagement is with African philosophy. I am familiar with the discussions as they relate to Africa. In recent years, I have expanded my reach to think about what African means much more broadly. So Brazilian Africans and Jamaican Africans are Africans or Black people in a very, very different way. And I think Blackness in the UK is going to be very, very different from Blackness in Asia or other places. Africana is a way of bringing in all those different identities. The fundamental question is, what does it mean to be real today? And I want to disagree with those people who are going to say that real means only a very limited range of things. So if I was to leave you with anything about what the engagement with oral philosophy is, it's a fundamental redefining of what the field of philosophy is. Philosophy, as given to me when I was going to graduate school, was something that the content had already been determined. If you want a degree in philosophy, here is what you do. And none of those things included Africana philosophy. If you wanted Africana philosophy, you had to go outside of those things. So one of the things that I think philosophy departments or the university should be doing is to allow for opportunities of those of you, those of us who are interested in expanding the field, to actually be able to do that, to read and talk about different ways of conceiving African philosophy or philosophy much more generally. Even as I'm saying that, it occurs to me that that is a dangerous project to engage in. Calling or hitting at people's identity is a fairly risky business, because philosophers, as I began by saying to you, are not very diverse in the United States, and they frown on any attempt to expand what philosophy means. And so those of us who are engaged in Africana philosophy have to find meetings on the side of the professional organizations. The main organizations have been much more welcoming lately, but the really interesting places are the small places in which Africana philosophers gather. So the people on your list as speakers this Michaelmas are people that I have followed and been interested in for a while, because our interests are quite in line. I wish that these interests were shared much more broadly in the field. We are getting there, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think a program such as yours allows for an opening for people to think. If you had never thought about philosophy as including Africana thought, here's an opportunity to think in those new ways. So again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll stop now, and maybe we can engage in a back and forth about questions and answers about things that have come up.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was amazing. And you brought in so many points, so very interesting to listen to them. For everyone that's attending the discussion group, feel free to put your hand up or put in the chat that you want to ask a question, or even just type out your question in the chat if you don't want to speak or whatever. I'll be happy to read it out, or raise your hand and I will be happy to let you ask some questions. But I have a lot of questions, so I think I'll go first. So like one of the things that I found really interesting about what you were talking about was, I guess, like the relationship, like, you know, this is something you mentioned about, like a lot of criticism about oral traditions, you know, not like making room for arguments, but also Okot Puppetech is using performance, you know, and oral traditions like theater to, you know, like be like, you know, to present like anti-colonial resistance. I think this is something you talk about in the podcast, where you know, like theater at the time was geared towards Western taste, and he questions that. And you know, through like, you know, the use of African oral traditions. And yet there seems to be this understanding of oral traditions as being quite hegemonic, I guess, not allowing for a lot of disagreements, and even like, you know, and this is a criticism that is also you know, that is presented by African philosophers themselves. And I guess I was wondering if you could talk a bit about where it is that oral tradition actually accommodates for differences, or maybe that how oral traditions can be perceived or read as like, you know, hegemonic, and maybe that is a misreading, or like, you know, how that perception even comes about.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. On the one hand, there's always the complaint that oral traditions are kind of uniform. Nobody disagrees with anybody else. But one of the other things we want to say is that oral traditions are a place where change can be made to happen. So I could tell you a story about some very real events that happened in the African context. Okot Pabitek, as the director of the National Cultural Theatre, with these ideas about what national performance should be, fell afoul of the government because those who were running the country and those who were running the theater programs did not agree with what he was proposing in many ways. And so it was seen as a challenge to the hegemony of what civilization and what culture and what performance is. As a result of those disagreements, it was dangerous for him to stay in Uganda. That is how he ended up in exile in Kenya, because he could not continue living on in Uganda. And so for a while, he was teaching at the University of Nairobi. He could not go back home because he had just disagreed so profoundly with the fundamental reading of what culture and civilization and performance is. On the Kenyan side, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, with these ideas about literature, he said, well, performances of the oral kind are the way that we exhibit what we mean. And sometimes we're going to be in agreement, sometimes not. And so he put together a troupe of performers from the local ethnic area he was from. And those plays criticized people in power. And for this, he was actually put in prison. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o ends up in a Kenyan prison because the government authorities do not think this is putting them in a very good light. And in prison, he writes his other book, Detained. So Detained is a prison memoir of what life was like in a Kenyan prison. These ideas have consequences in terms of, if we perform what we really mean, they're going to be different ideas from what the ruling ideas are. And those are usually seen as being very dangerous. So culture can do that. It does that sometimes in your face. And so the people who were performing plays were actually making fun of government leaders who are neo-colonial. And the thing that leaders do not want is to be made fun of in ways that engage the community. So philosophy in this case was something people did together as a community. And that had the effect of making uncomfortable people who are in power. So it sometimes does that. If it does not end up in exile or prison, the ways in which oral traditions are a place for disagreement are, people will tell each other stories and riddles about what our people believed. And in the telling of the stories, we can engage with each other in terms of what we think the correct interpretation is. So not any interpretation you give to these things is going to be valid. So there are people who are very good at interpreting what the oral stories are. And there are those who can use the oral stories to actually bring about change as a way of critiquing what is happening. So one of the things that happened, sometimes it's very subtle ways. The people who are writing feminist literature in Africa did not really call it feminist literature. They simply talked about, here is daily life. People do this and then they do this other thing. And by the end of it, you realize opportunities are very unevenly handed out in some societies. And the point they're making is unequal opportunities are not a good thing to do. So if we became a much better society, we would have a much better realignment of what the opportunities were. Now, if you are not looking, you miss that whole point. And I think what good literature does is it allows people to speak at multiple levels. So those who are not attuned will say, yeah, everybody agrees with everybody else. But to understand a culture, you must know when something different is being said. And so this is the importance of being attuned to what the culture is. Anytime you go into a new culture, I think the difficulty for us is to figure out, so what is happening around me? I don't know what is happening. If you understand the culture, you know exactly that what was not said was actually a very bad thing that you should make change in. And if it has to be explained to you, you obviously are not smart enough to figure it out, and there's work to do. So this is a long way of answering the question that, yes, people think that cultural traditions are uniform, that they bring about uniformity, but they have depth, they have multiple layers of interpretation. To be good at African culture, you must really understand what you're looking at. And so what does it mean becomes the question philosophers are always asking. Things might mean different things. And so one ought to be attuned to looking into that. So I hope this answers what you're asking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we'll go to Milky, Leonard, and then Justin, and then Leah. So feel free to. Sam, do you want to take one question after another, or do you want to hear all three questions?
Well, let's do them one by one. My attention span is getting limited by the year, so let's do one by one. Yeah.
Okay, so Milky, if you want to go first, go for it.
Hi, my name is Milky. I apologize for the very basicness of my question because I've just started to get interested in African culture and history, and I would like to concentrate on philosophy. What are there any? Is there like a book list on how to get started in studying and getting a sense of Africana philosophy that you can recommend? Any authors or syllabi?
Well, I think I had most of the question, but let me just repeat it to be sure. It seems like you're asking, if one wanted to get started, where do you go? What are there some texts that could work as a beginning point? And if that is the question, yeah.
Got it.
Oh, okay. There are many books one could go to. I'm always shy about giving a reading list, but I spent a lot of my early career sorting through, if you wanted African philosophy, what do you read? And in the early 1980s and 90s, there were not many textbooks about, so what is African philosophy? So those of us who started then found ourselves needing to write the books that would be used. So my first book simply came out as a result of that. Introduction to African Philosophy. There are many anthologies. So an anthology like English Parker and Kibujo Kalumba, African Philosophy, A Classical Approach, would be a good one to look at. If you are interested simply in African philosophy, you get a sense of what some of the questions are. There is, well, Senai Sekwerebehan, I could write these things out at some point, has an anthology, the Essentials of African Philosophy. That would be also be useful. But if you're thinking about one text that will guide you, the philosopher Kwasi Wiredu put out, I think it is an Oxford Companion to African Philosophy. And there are a number of essays. It doesn't give you a concise.
I'm looking for the book right now. I bought a book that
Yep.
is a series. I can't exhume. No, that's a Springer book. I'm sorry. That was published by Springer, and I can't pronounce the title.
Yeah,
But
I'm not aware of that one. So this is one of those I do not know. But what I could do with people, if the organizers have a list of who all is here, I have a list of some of the things I give to my students. If you are interested, here is what you could look at. I could provide that list, and then you can simply go through. Africana philosophy is very broad, and so it is impossible to cover everything. My own interests are in African philosophy, and then I'll give you what is it that I think of as being much more central. Then we can talk about where else one goes from there. But right now we have a few more resources than we did only 15 or 20 years ago.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.
Justin, if you want to go next.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Professor Imbo, for that. That's really great. You mentioned a few times the issue of whether Africans, have the critical acumen for philosophy, or whether they're all just agreeing with each other all the time. So I was wondering what you thought about philosophic sagacity and sage philosophy as a project. You mentioned Oderuka, and I just was wondering what you thought of that whole kind of movement in African philosophy, if it's a useful exercise or not.
Okay, thank you for that question. Sagacity is one of the things that I have been thinking about for a while. Oderuka was one of my mentors, and so one of the things that happened was he roped me in fairly early when he was doing interviews with people to kind of transcribe what had happened. And so I kind of got in at the bottom of the ladder in that sense. I did not know this was going to be part of my life's work, but back then he was simply interviewing what he thought were wise people and what they thought about different things. And that I turned into a book. So there's a book about a sagacity that he wrote. That is a worthwhile project. It is a good thing to do. His idea was philosophy does not need to be written down. It could simply be what people have worked through in oral ways. And so that was his beginning point. In the interviews, he had a set of questions. He asked these people about various things, and they gave him answers. So in the end, he thought what he did was demonstrate that critical thinking is not reliant on writing. I have usually found it odd or ironic that in order to make that point, he had to write it down. So, so Odera talks about writing not important, but we are talking about this today because all this stuff is written down. But I guess that the point he's making is writing is not central. Simply having the ideas and talking about them is what is central. The problem the sages in Africa had was the reach was not very great. Not many people could hear what they had to say. I am kind of honored that in my own lifetime, I have been able to talk to people. I have been able to do a podcast. I have been able to do Zoom talks. And these are all oral ways of doing the same thing. It does not change the content of what we're doing. It's simply ways of transmission. The old people did not have that. The critical thought was still with them. So I am in line with that project. I think Odera was onto something. One of my colleagues who worked with Odera thought the project was missing in something important, which is very few women sages were interviewed. So the author, my friend Gail Presby, who teaches in Detroit, makes the point that sagacity needs to expand the kinds of people that we talk to. And so part of her work has been interviewing and looking at the work of sages who are not very different from what Odera did. But I think these are supplementing different pieces. Odera gave a start, and then other people might do other things. These are projects that have happened mostly in East Africa. I assume the same things could be done in other parts of Africa to see were there people who are critical thinkers, even with the absence of writing. And it seems to me that ought to be easily established. Writing helps, but it is not what makes philosophy. I find it very helpful to have philosophical texts, but if I limited myself to just that, I would be missing out on a whole lot of the wealth of information that is out there. So my sense of sagacity is that it has done some fairly good things. It could be expanded in ways that a number of people are currently doing. So if you're interested in a project, that would be one thing to think a little bit more about.
Very quick follow-up. Do you
sure.
happen to know Ochieng Odiambo? Because I think he had
Yes,
a similar, he had a similar start. He taught me philosophy in my undergrad.
Yeah. I also know Ochieng Odiambo. Those of us who came up at the same time, the circle was small back then. And so if you think about the chances of meeting people, it was a lot more. And luckily, as a matter of accident and just being in the right place, I have access to those people. There have been meetings at which we were attending together, and we said, if somebody was to destroy this building right now, they would take out all the African philosophers in the world currently. And we don't all want to be in the same place at the same time. But yeah, Ochieng Odiambo has also been pursuing African philosophy. But since he moved to the Caribbean, he's expanding Africana philosophy in that sense. How do these ideas play out in other parts of the world? So yeah, thank you for those questions.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we'll go to Leah next, but I think Milty had a follow-up that we can get to after.
Thank you very much, Professor Imbo. I thought that was really, really interesting. And I have a question that I think relates a bit to what you were just saying to Justin, or in answer to Justin's question. And it also draws on some of the things you said in the podcast about communities doing philosophy, and how that's maybe another challenge that oral traditions face, or people who do philosophy in an oral setting face, is that there seems to be a prejudice that communities can't do philosophy. And I was wondering whether you think that there are things we can learn from within university settings, from oral traditions of philosophy, where it's completely normal to arguably do philosophy in a community setting. And I mean, I'm thinking also about how all the informal ways in which we already do that to some extent at universities, when we do conferences and we exchange ideas orally and we talk to our peers, and we're encouraged to do that. But it seems that there's still this idea that if you want to do philosophy, it's got to be single authored and all of that. And I often feel like that's an obstacle. And yeah, my question is, how do you think we can actually learn from these traditions of oral philosophy that have been doing this and did this, and yeah, what progress we can make on that front?
Thank you for that too. I think philosophy is best done together. So communities doing philosophy is one way to think about it. A university, if it is running properly, ought to be a place in which we come together and talk about different things. We create values, we create an ethos, and we get talking about different ideas. And that is the way that we make progress. We disagree and agree on some things. When I first went into philosophy, I was horrified that the idea of a philosophical meeting was one in which somebody stood up and read a paper. So it was actually reading, not talking about ideas. And at the end of it, people would say how horrible what you had said was. So the first person to get in and say, I disagree with you on about everything, but let's begin in the middle and work our way. So that is what philosophy was. It was very adversarial. And that makes a certain assumption about what philosophy is. That if you don't disagree with people, sometimes violently, sometimes in negative ways, you're not really doing philosophy. The traditional cultures might teach the philosophical community this one thing: we can have fun while doing this. We don't need to be disagreeable in the searching for ideas together. Sometimes the best disagreements are those in which you realize that at the end of this, we still have to live together. We still have to go to the same places. So if I disagree with you on something, I still have to talk to you about that other thing tomorrow. I cannot be really disagreeable in ways that put you off. And so one of the lessons from communities for me is just getting along, because we are all in this together. It's not about individuals. Communities can do philosophy in that way. So what kind of culture have we created? What kind of ethos do we have? And I think many departments are inhospitable places because they encourage this idea of fighting, this idea of shouting at other people who have different things. They discourage the idea of writing in ways that are accessible. So one of the things you'll hear is, if the people can understand what you're saying, you're not doing philosophy very well. I think communities ought to tell us that you want to be understood by the general public, and the idea of public philosophy is really fascinating on that account. Do the people understand what you're doing? And universities are in a very good place to learn about all these things, about how do we go about these things. We are part of the same. And I think those who do not see that then are unable to actually engage in ways that foster community. Even though the work that comes out at the end is going to be credited to one person, I wrote this book or I wrote this article, but you never do these things in isolation. It is always in talking with other people, in learning from other ideas. So the best people are those who acknowledge that in my coming to this thinking, I benefited from talking to this person, hearing from this other person, disagreeing with this other one, and learning the ways in which we could move to a new place. That is the best kind of philosophy. So I don't know if this is specific enough, but the ways in which we engage, communities which live together have learned that you cannot really always be fighting with people you live with. You can disagree, but you can disagree in ways that are friendly and have fun while doing it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I think, like Milty said, well, she talks about how Socrates wrote nothing down, and Plato's dialogues are, in a sense, dramatic presentation. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything because your hand is still raised, but yeah.
No, I was just pointing out the argument that how can it be philosophy if it's not written down? Socrates wrote nothing down. And the use of theater as an agent or vehicle of philosophy is that, Plato's dialogues are, in a sense, dramatic presentations. You have characters and they have lines, and there's a back and forth. And just to reinforce that, philosophy in its beginnings was a conversation. As a matter of fact, it was a drinking party. If you think of the symposia, the symposium. And my background is in classical languages, so so I think a lot of it is a colonialism that they do not want to allow for other cultures to have a philosophy of their own, or to respect the modes and the vehicles that philosophy is passed down or progresses through a society. That's just my argument against gatekeepers and colonialism. Also, I did find the book published by Springer. It's called Ezumezu, A System of Logic for African Philosophy and Studies by Jonathan Chimakonam. I haven't finished it yet. It's very dense for me to start. I don't understand all of the terms. So that's why I'm like, let me start at the beginning. But thank you.
Well, thank you. That is a book that I'm not familiar with. I should look that up. So there are going to be many places to begin. Introductions can come from many places. Some of them are going to be more familiar than others. But going back to something you said, which is, Socrates did not write down. I think we ought to repeat that point. It is not the writing down that makes it philosophical. And especially the point about drinking, we should all drink more, I think. But maybe this is not advice I should be giving to people internationally. When I was going to graduate school, I had a philosopher colleague who said to us, here is a conclusion you can have to any argument. You can say whatever it is you want to say, but the conclusion can always be, therefore let us drink. And he said, the argument is always valid if you say that. And he was making the point about philosophy and drinking. So this is not serious at all, but I think philosophy need not be written down to be really important.
So there was a comment in the comment section, and it's actually from Shangita Shen, who's my mom. And she said, with reference to the importance of oral tradition, the idea of sagacity and wisdom, I'm reminded of something from India. You know, like the Vedas was never written down, which is why they are referred to as Shruti. That is something which is transmitted orally and learned by listening. I guess I was wondering if she's
Yeah. So the idea of there are other texts around the world which were not written, and they're really, really important. So the Vedas would be just an example of that. So the preference for writing is a fairly specific way to think about philosophy. And I think it has caused a lot of people pain in terms of, if you are not doing writing, then you're not really engaged in what is really important. And I think that is what we want to get away from, the idea of philosophy as writing. Writing is convenient. We get to talking and writing about different things. But once we begin the presumption that writing is the whole ballgame, I think that is where the problems are. Yeah. One problem I did not talk about earlier is, if we go oral, then the issue of what language are we going to use becomes one that needs addressing. And in the African context, that became a real issue. Every country has many languages in it. And so if you are oral culture, the oral traditions of one people are not going to be those of the others. And so how are we going to talk about all that? Now, I sidestepped that whole discussion because by default, I think English has become the language of the internet, the language of the world. There are other international languages, but that also has a cost. So when we're doing this stuff in English or German or French, there's something we're not doing. And part of what Okot Babitek was interested in is, if you cannot sing these songs in Acholi, you're missing out something. If you do not speak African languages. So one of the tragedies of modern life is those of us who are born in African places, but cannot now speak African languages. How do you carry on oral traditions in that context? And so it is an ongoing existential issue about something is really, really important, but the conditions in the world have made it impossible to carry on. What do you do? In the context of Africa, then, one stopgap is to do philosophy in these other languages, but add in as much as we can from oral traditions. So this was the tack Chinua Achebe took in the writing of his novels. You must use English, but in so doing, you can put a whole lot that is Nigerian and African in it. So if you're writing about India, there are many things you can add into a novel or a book about some other topic, which people can then go back and find out. So how do we do philosophy today becomes a question that is live. Yeah.
I think, like, my mom has something to add, and then after that we'll go on to Alice, because I think she has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ma, you're fine. You're on
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Imbo, for a very illuminating talk. It was really refreshing. Just to add to what you just said, that this overemphasis on literacy, and that writing thing is also so restrictive, in the sense that in India we know several languages are there without scripts, right? So yeah. As soon as somebody puts a lot of emphasis or kind of exclusive emphasis on writing and written text and the way of doing philosophy or literature or any practice is really to be taken seriously enough, then what we are doing in effect is actually negating an entire community and their, communal kind of wisdom they might have, their stories and everything. Basically, we are actually deleting communities. So it is so exclusive, and it is fundamentally against the idea of university, and egalitarianism. So on so many levels, it is so problematic, that overemphasis on, it's just cultural homogenization, and it's just deeply problematic.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Well, thank you for emphasizing that point. I think this is exactly what the problem is. If you emphasize writing, you're doing much more than simply talking theory. You're talking about people's identity and people's culture. And so once you have taken that away, it's very easy to dismiss their religion or their way of life or their literature or other things. And so for me, philosophy has always been political in this sense. When I went to school, we were told philosophy was the dispassionate interest in ideas, and it really has little to do with the real world. But this is said by people who have the power on their side at the moment. It is those of us who grew up in colonial places, you realize that if you said that, you'd be losing out at the very beginning. And so philosophy is always about who are you as a person and what is it that is taken seriously. Identity is at stake. So I have been in long disagreements with colleagues who thought philosophers should not be doing anything political. And I say, you really have no choice. Anytime you talk about defining, you are doing something political. You may deny that this is what you're doing, but this is exactly what you're doing. If you talk about philosophy as right,
Sorry, Sam, you seem to have cut out. Can't hear you for some reason. Oh, now you're back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sometimes the technology gods are against us. I don't. Sometimes that happens. I'm glad that it did not cut out completely. But I was simply saying that people who think of philosophy as not political are actually downplaying how important it is. And it is usually to hide a sense of privilege that they already have. What one needs to understand is that people who are fighting for inclusion of Africana philosophy are doing a very political thing. And that is not a bad thing. Philosophy has always been political. We just denied that this is what was happening. So yeah, I really like that last point about identity, and much more important than simply discussion of pure ideas. We are discussing ideas, yes, but we're discussing much more than just ideas.
Thank you.
Great. Alice, if you want to go next.
Sure. Oh, sorry. Thank you. My question relates to a specific phrase that you used in the podcast we listened to for today, but also the discussion. I was wondering, use the term lost in translation and how problems might become lost in translation. And I was wondering specifically how bringing the conversation of the oral tradition contributes to this comment, because you could discuss that in philosophy of language without pretending that you're not participating in like orality. And perhaps say, like, I study Indian Madhyamika, but it also comes up in like Wittgenstein. Some people might say a lot of problems and philosophical problems just come down to misuses of like language. But it could be that there is a problem that you're not seeing, as you also have mentioned, like something you don't articulate, but perhaps sometimes that they are problems that come down to what we do with language. And it seems to me like there is something else that talking about orality brings to that, to do with context. And you talked about this in the episode with like community and stuff, but I was just wondering, and like intention and exchange and what you're doing and engaging in that conversation. But I was just wondering if you could comment further on that, because I was curious. Thank you.
Yeah, let me comment on that. I use the phrase lost in translation in the podcast because Okot Pabitek was interested in how Christianity showed up in Africa. And so part of what was his interest is how do you translate ideas into the local language? How do you translate specific parts of the Bible into the local language? And he thought some things cannot be said in our language because we don't care about those things. If you care about them, your language has ideas and words for them. We may not care about those things, and so we don't have the same things. So if you try to a one-to-one correlation between what I find here and what I'm giving to you, you're going to miss a lot. And so part of what was happening to him, he thought was impositions of ideas that were alien into a context in which they did not fit, and then assuming that people understood what was being said. So this was problematic on a whole lot of levels. We don't have the concept, we don't have the idea. And I go back to the creation stories. If you believe in the Genesis stories about God creates out of nothing, they actually had a difficult time understanding what creation out of nothing might mean. Because if you are a creator, in the actually mind, you're always creating from something. If you are a creator, you're standing someplace in order to create. How is that working? And so any translation of, and God said, let there be X, and there was X, is a very difficult thing to render in a local language because it assumes certain things about how creation works. Now, if I don't go deep and think, oh, in my idea of creation, I have this notion of creating out of nothing, which might not apply in other contexts. How do I render that in the local place? It becomes very, very difficult to talk about it. And the missionary was not interested in that discussion. He was interested in getting you to believe what they wanted you to believe. And here is what we say where I come from, and you better say it too. And so the local people were not stupid. Oh, that is what you want me to say? I will say that. And that will get you off my back for a while. A lot of the acceptance of these things was pragmatic. People wanted the missionary in because the missionary brought medicine and they brought religion, they brought schooling. So what I want is schooling and medicine. I will trust what you tell me about the language. So that we have not really fixed the deep issues with what translation is. The loss in translation is something that you want to bring in and you do not quite succeed because there is not a match in the place you're going. Together with the loss in translation, Okot Pabitek talked about something he called intellectual smuggling. So the smuggling of ideas from one place to another. Many of the Africans realized we don't have this idea. This is not something that we do. But my Christian brothers and sisters tell me this is an important thing. And so if I want to convert my local generation, I will say to them what the new religion says. And so they bring into the local setting ideas which are not found in there. So they smuggle ideas into the local place, fully knowing what they're doing. We don't have this idea. It is an alien one, but we'll put it in here just because it is useful in getting more converts. And Okot Pabitek was really disturbed by those dual measures. So the lost part and the smuggling part went hand in hand because languages are difficult to work with. You need to understand languages perfectly to be able to tell what works and what doesn't work. Now, there's never been a translation that is 100%. So I don't think Okot Pabitek was saying we always need to be perfectly in line with what is happening. There are many of my good friends I don't understand 100%. If I understand them 38%, I'm happy with that. I don't know what the acceptable percentage here would be. But in languages, there was a lot in religion that was being added that was not there. So that is part of the issue. You talked about intent. Okot Pabitek thinks there is evil intent always. Whenever you see loss in translation and you see intellectual smuggling, there was something evil that had been planned and was happening. And the evil thing was converting the local people to an alien way of thinking. If that is your goal, you'll do anything that you want to do for that purpose. So this is why he looked down on or made fun of religions which came to him from other places. They were not being done on the level. They were simply being imposed on, or people were being misled into believing them. So that is the extent of what I can add to the loss in translation. If you have an idea that does not happen in another language, what do you do? I'm just trying to think that English is not a very good language in which to express some ideas. I'm just thinking, suppose you are happy and this happiness is slowly turning into sorrow or horror. I don't know that English has a word for happiness that is turning into horror and sorrow. There might be an in-between feeling. I'm sure other languages might have in-between words that reflect something. How do you render this thing that is fairly complex? If you cannot do it, one of the ways you do it is simply by imposing it. And then we are completely lost. So that would be my sense in the intent is always not positive. There was evil that was being perpetuated by the loss in translation and the smuggling.
Thank you.
I'm really glad that we could talk about intellectual smuggling, because I actually like the podcast, like it was a really interesting part of the podcast, and it's just been an idea that's been on my mind since I listened to it. So very interesting. But also we're nearly at time, so I think we have time for one more question. So if anyone has a question, go for it. If not, I have a question. Okay, I guess I'll go. Like I'm a history student myself. So like something that I was thinking about was, so like language, and there was something called the linguistic turn that happens in the like 80s and 90s within historiography, but mainly feminist historiography. So feminist historians take up this really post-structuralist critique after a period of like domination of like Marxist theories within the writing of history, and they really start focusing on language and discourse as like a site of where like power relations are being constructed as well as reinforced. And I guess I was wondering how this focus on language and how important orality is important in a social as well as cultural context interacts with much more older traditions of oral traditions within Africana philosophy. And I was wondering whether I guess a lot of these Western ideas that come from feminist theory, how does that interact, and maybe what are the similarities and dissimilarities in the ways that they come up with like different concepts that exist transnationally within various societies.
Yeah. Let me see if I can answer that. In the oral tradition, how do ideas there mesh with ideas that come from another place? And you mentioned particularly feminism. Feminism is an interesting discussion within African oral traditions, because the assumption is usually that it's a difficult thing to do, given the way oral traditions work. And so feminists have had a really tricky entry into the discussion. So I was just thinking about, and we didn't talk about this much in my earlier comments, and thank you for bringing up the question. There are a lot of African writers who are doing feminist work who do not call themselves feminists. And the reason they do that is because what has come to the world as feminism seems objectionable to them. So what they're doing is simply highlighting in their literature the unequal relations between the genders and what is happening. So feminism is an important thing, but that label does not quite work. So we need to distinguish between the concept and the language that we use. You could do the work without calling yourself certain things. So when I look at the Africana philosophy, especially in the African context, feminists appear in various ways. So the examples I would give you are, those of us who live in the internet age, here are things you could Google at some point. There was a TED talk given in 2009 by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and the title of it was The Danger of a Single Story. She was making the point here about, if I think certain things about Africans, I'm gonna fall short in all kinds of ways. But I think the much more relevant one is a later podcast, TED talk, in which she talks about we should all be feminists. And that has become the subject of a small book. So there's a book now called We Should All Be Feminist. And she's talking about, yeah, I may not call myself a feminist, I may not adopt that term, but I am really interested in the same issues that other people around the world might be interested in. So there is that sort of thing. There are feminists in the regular way of thinking about the struggle for gender equality. So on the internet, you could also find, there's a site called African Feminist Forum, in which they're using the language of the academy to actually talk about the ways in which oral traditions might be helpful. So when you talk about how do these ideas mesh in with other ideas from other places, there's at least usually not a one-to-one correlation. You have to kind of find the ways in which to enter the discussion, and the usual language may not be helpful in terms of, we already make assumptions about what a feminist is. We make assumptions about what progress is. We make assumptions about all kinds of things. Those assumptions may not work from context to context. So in the African tradition, if you ever wanted to help, if you wanted to make change, you can use ideas from the academy, but there are times that the ideas themselves are going to need reworking. And so part of what it means to be a good scholar is to see ways in which, how do these ideas work in this new context? And that is true in other areas as well. So I'm not familiar with the particular cases that you're mentioning, but the ways in which ideas about progress in this very one limited field work show that you need to understand context in a much broader sense before you actually become helpful to making change.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're at 6:30, so I guess maybe we'll end it here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the discussion group. I know a couple of people left around 6, but this was just very nice, very cool discussion. I'm just wondering, Sam, if you have any ending remarks that you'd like to say.
My ending remarks are similar to yours. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This was a wonderful opportunity. And I am really encouraged that there are people who are interested in these things which seem rather esoteric, they seem rather alien, they seem outside of the academy. They shouldn't be. We are all going to have made progress when we don't think of this as being new or unique. They're simply part of what a university does. The more of us do this, the better it is going to be. So thank you for doing the good work. Thank you for keeping up the good fight.
Thank you so much for coming and leading this discussion group. This was just amazing and we learned so much. But yeah, thank you all for coming.
And we will be in touch. Thank you again, and yeah. Bye.